The first snow came early that year, settling over the valley like a heavy blanket just as October turned the corner into November. Margaret stood at the window of her small cabin, watching the flakes drift down through the pines, and felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. The wood stove in the corner radiated heat, but she knew from bitter experience that it would struggle to keep the whole space warm once the real cold arrived. Last winter, she'd slept in her coat more nights than not, and she'd gone through her woodpile so quickly that by March she was burning green wood that smoked and sputtered and gave off barely any heat at all. She was 50, 3 years old, living alone on 20 acres she'd inherited from her father, and she was tired of being cold. The cabin was small by most standards, just 800 square feet, but it might as well have been a mansion for all the trouble she had heating it. The wood stove sat against the north wall, a squat black thing her grandfather had installed sometime in the 1940s, and while it worked well enough if you stood directly in front of it, the heat seemed to die before it reached the bedroom at the far end of the cabin. She'd tried everything she could think of: weather, stripping the windows, stuffing insulation into every crack she could find, even hanging heavy blankets across doorways to contain the warmth. Nothing made enough difference, but Margaret had not survived 5 decades of life, including 15 years alone on this mountain, by giving up easily. She'd taught herself to fix the well pump when it broke, to patch the roof when the winter storms tore shingles loose, to keep her old truck running with little more than determination and a borrowed set of tools. If there was a way to make that stove heat her home properly, she would find it. She'd been thinking about the problem for weeks, turning it over in her mind during the long hours she spent splitting wood or working in her garden. The stove itself was sound cast iron, built to last generations. The problem was that most of the heat it generated went straight up the chimney or radiated out in a small circle around the stove itself. What she needed was a way to capture that heat and move it to where it was needed. The idea had come to her one afternoon while she was cleaning out the shed behind the cabin. She'd been looking for her good rake, and instead found a pile of steel pipes left over from when she'd replumbed the kitchen sink a few years back. She'd stood there in the dusty light filtering through the shed's single window, holding a 3-foot length of pipe in her hands, and suddenly she'd seen it. A way to pull heat from the stove and push it throughout the cabin. The concept was simple, at least in theory. Heat rises, and the area around her stovepipe was the hottest spot in the entire cabin. If she could run pipes through that hot zone, she could heat water or air inside those pipes, and if she could move that heated air or water to other parts of the cabin, she could distribute warmth more evenly. It was basic thermodynamics, the kind of thing she'd learned about in high school physics before she dropped out to help her father run the family logging operation. She spent 3 days planning, sketching designs on the backs of envelopes and old newspapers, calculating angles and airflow and heat transfer rates to the best of her ability. She drove into town to the hardware store where old Eddie Thompson raised his eyebrows at her purchases. More steel pipe, elbows and joints, sheets of thin metal, height, temperature sealant, and a small circulation fan that could run off her solar panel setup. She didn't explain what she was building, and he didn't ask. That was the way of things up here. People minded their own business. Back at the cabin, Margaret cleared the area around the stove and laid out her materials. She'd done welding before, years ago, when she'd helped her father repair equipment for the logging operation. But her hands weren't as steady as they'd once been, and her eyes weren't as sharp. She set up her father's old arc welder in the cleared space, put on the heavy leather gloves and the helmet with the dark glass, and began to work. The first step was to build a heat exchanger that would sit around the stovepipe where it rose from the stove. She cut the steel pipes into sections and welded them into a framework that would surround the pipe without touching it, leaving a gap for air to flow. The welding went slowly. Her first few joints were sloppy, the beads uneven and pocked with holes where she'd moved too fast or held the electrode at the wrong angle. She ground them down and did them again and again until they were solid and clean. The work took her back to a different time, to hot summers in the equipment shed with her father, the two of them working side by side to fix a broken log loader or repair a damaged truck frame. He'd been a patient teacher, never raising his voice even when she made mistakes, always showing her the right way to do things. Measure twice, cut once, he used to say, and if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. He'd been gone 10 years now, but she could still hear his voice sometimes, especially when she was working with her hands. It took her a week to build the heat exchanger. When it was finished, it looked like a metal cage that fit around the stovepipe, with inlet and outlet ports for air to flow through. The theory was that cool air would enter at the bottom, rise through the cage as it heated up around the hot stovepipe, and exit at the top, where she would direct it through more pipes to the far end of the cabin. Next came the distribution system. She welded together a network of pipes that would run along the ceiling, carrying the heated air from the exchanger to vents positioned over the bedroom and the bathroom. The pipes had to be angled just right to allow the hot air to rise naturally, though she could use the small fan to boost the circulation if needed. She drilled holes through the wall where the pipes would pass through, careful not to compromise the cabin's structure, and used height, temperature sealant to make sure no cold air could leak in around the penetrations. The hardest part was mounting everything safely. The heat exchanger had to be positioned precisely around the stovepipe, close enough to capture the heat, but not so close that it would create a fire hazard. She built a support frame from angle iron, welding it together in sections and then bolting it to the wall studs behind the stove. She worked slowly and carefully, checking and rechecking her measurements, making sure everything was level and plumb and secure. There were moments when she doubted herself. Late one night, after a particularly frustrating day when nothing seemed to fit together right, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and wondered if she was wasting her time. Maybe she should just accept that the cabin would be cold in winter, that she would wear layers and sleep under piles of blankets and burn through her woodpile like she always had. Maybe this whole project was just foolishness, an old woman's stubborn refusal to accept her limitations. But the next morning she was back at it, because that was who she was. She'd never been one to quit in the middle of something, and she wasn't going to start now. As she worked, she made adjustments to her original design. She added baffles inside the heat exchanger to slow the airflow and give it more time to absorb heat. She insulated the distribution pipes with scraps of fiberglass wrapped in aluminum foil to prevent heat loss as the air traveled to the far end of the cabin. She installed dampers that would let her control how much air flowed through different parts of the system, so she could adjust the heat distribution to match her needs. The weather turned colder as she worked. By mid-November, the temperature was dropping below freezing at night, and frost coated the windows every morning. She kept the wood stove burning, feeding it throughout the day, and the cabin stayed warm enough in the main room, but the bedroom remained cold. She worked with increasing urgency, knowing that real winter was coming, and once the heavy snows arrived, everything would be harder. Finally, 3 weeks after she'd started, the system was complete. She stood back and looked at what she'd built, a complex network of steel pipes and vents and dampers, all welded together and mounted around and above her wood stove. It looked rough and industrial, nothing like the sleek heating systems she'd seen in magazines or in the nicer homes down in the valley, but it was solid and well-made, and it was hers. She spent an afternoon testing everything, checking for leaks and hot spots, and making sure all the joints were secure. She adjusted the dampers, experimenting with different settings. She connected the circulation fan and made sure it was working properly. And then, as the sun set and the temperature dropped and another cold night approached, she loaded the wood stove with dry oak and pine, lit it, and waited to see if her invention would work. For the first hour, nothing seemed different. The stove heated up as it always did, and the main room grew warm while the bedroom stayed cold. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, watching the stovepipe and the heat exchanger around it, trying not to feel discouraged. She told herself to be patient, that it would take time for the whole system to heat up, that she couldn't expect miracles. But then, slowly, she began to notice a change. The air coming from the vent over the bedroom doorway felt warm to her hand. Not hot, but definitely warm, warmer than it had any right to be considering how far it was from the stove. She walked into the bedroom and felt the difference immediately. The cold that usually pooled in that room like standing water was being pushed back by a gentle flow of warm air from the ceiling vent. She stood there for a long moment, hardly daring to believe it. Then she went back to the main room and adjusted the dampers, directing more air toward the bedroom. And when she checked again 15 minutes later, the change was even more pronounced. The bedroom wasn't as warm as the main room, not yet, but it was warmer than it had been in all the years she'd lived here. Margaret sat down heavily in her armchair, suddenly aware of how tired she was, how much tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders and neck. All those hours of planning and welding and doubting and trying again, and it had actually worked. The heat from her wood stove, instead of going straight up the chimney or dying a few feet from the firebox, was being captured and distributed throughout her home. She let the fire burn down to coals that night, then loaded the stove again with hardwood and adjusted the dampers one more time before going to bed. She didn't wear her coat, didn't pile on extra blankets. She just climbed under her regular quilt and lay there in the darkness, feeling the warmth flowing from the vent above her bed, and for the first time in many winters, she was comfortable. The system worked even better than she'd hoped. As December arrived and the serious cold settled over the mountains, Margaret kept her wood stove burning and her pipes delivered heat to every corner of the cabin. She burned less wood than in previous years because the heat was being used more efficiently instead of wasting up the chimney. The bedroom stayed warm, the bathroom stayed warm, even the corners and shadows that had always been cold now shared in the general comfort. She found herself making small improvements as she went along. She added a water tank to the system, a 5-gallon container that sat on top of the heat exchanger and provided hot water for washing. She installed a thermometer at each vent so she could monitor the temperature in different parts of the cabin. She built a small deflector that directed some of the warm air toward her boot, drying rack by the door. Word got around, as it always did in small communities. Eddie Thompson from the hardware store mentioned to someone that Margaret had bought a bunch of pipe and welding supplies, and someone else had seen smoke coming from her place at odd hours and wondered what she was up to. By January, she'd had 3 different neighbors stop by on various pretexts, and all of them ended up asking about her heating system. She showed them what she'd built, explaining how the heat exchanger worked and how the pipes distributed the warm air. Some of them looked skeptical, but they couldn't argue with the results. Her cabin was undeniably warm, warmer than most of their own homes despite being older and less well insulated. One of them, a younger man named Tom, who'd moved up from the city a few years back and was still learning how to survive mountain winters, asked if she could help him build a similar system for his place. Margaret agreed, partly because she liked Tom and his wife, partly because she could use the money, and partly because it felt good to share what she'd learned. They spent 2 weekends at Tom's cabin, building a heat exchanger and distribution system adapted to his layout. Tom proved to be a quick learner and a decent welder, and Margaret found she enjoyed teaching him, passing along the skills her father had taught her all those years ago. As winter wore on and the snow piled deeper and the nights grew longer, Margaret's cabin remained an island of warmth and comfort. She sat by her stove on February evenings, reading or mending clothes or just watching the firelight, and felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. She'd identified a problem, worked out a solution, and made it real with her own hands and mind. She'd taken control of her own comfort instead of just enduring the cold and hoping for spring. There were still hard days, of course. There was still wood to split and haul, still snow to shovel, still all the 100 small difficulties of living alone on a mountain in winter. But she faced them with better spirits now, knowing that at the end of each hard day there was a warm cabin waiting for her, heated not just by burning wood, but by her own ingenuity and determination. When spring finally came and the snow began to melt, and the first brave flowers pushed up through the last patches of ice, Margaret looked at the pipes and vents and welded joints that crisscrossed her cabin's ceiling, and she didn't see an ugly industrial contraption. She saw evidence of her own capability, proof that she could still learn and build and solve problems that mattered. She saw her father's patient teaching bearing fruit decades later. She saw that she'd taken a small space that had never quite felt like home and made it truly hers. And when the first cold snap of the following autumn arrived and she lit her wood stove for the first time in months, feeling the familiar warmth begin to spread through the pipes and vents to every corner of her small cabin, Margaret smiled. Winter could come. She was ready for it now, and she would be warm,